so much, everyone, for being here. And 18 things come to my mind, but a small one is my friend Helen Marger's here, who is from St. Pete, but now lives in Lake Lure. For like the past 20 years, we've been walking around soccer fields and neighborhoods, and she's been like, you're going to put that in your book. You're going to put that in your book. And we never thought it would happen. And then she's like, yeah, I'm going to be on your book tour. So
here I am.
Kind of pictured us on the Oprah sofa, but
She retired.
She retired. So obviously Malaprops is the second best option. So anyway, so that's just wild to actually have written a book, 2 books, and have Helen here. As other people who mean a lot to me. And this is just such a great moment to be here. Okay, so I'm going to start with reading one essay so that y'all can just get a little taste of the flavor. So my books are collections of essays. They're in the memoir, which Ellen used to say memoir. I'm like, girl, you're from Florida. Don't try to pretend you're from France. But I'm in the memoir genre, but it's not like my life story. It's moments in life or incidents in life that, and I'll get to that. A lot of them happen to all of us, but I'm just the obnoxious person that writes about them. So this is one that actually resonates, and I've read it numerous times, but it's very special to read it here with another lifelong friend, Bob Wynn, who came in from Montreat, because it's about when my father died. And well, actually it's not, yeah, it was after he died. Bob went all the way from Montreat to Raleigh to be there when my father died. So anyway, so it sounds like it's gonna be depressing, but it's actually, I'm like Cindy Brady, like I'm just staring at the red light, like, you know, when they went on that, like the dance show. Anyway, I'm gonna remember that I have live people here. Okay. Okay, so this chapter is called With My People. The day before my father's funeral, frost dusted the grass at the cemetery. Oh, and I'm sorry, for people that don't know, my dad wrote a newspaper column in Raleigh for 63 years. He was an editor and reporter also, but he also just wrote a human interest column. Okay, the day with my people. The day before my father's funeral, frost dusted the grass at the cemetery, but the January ground wasn't frozen. When I pushed the wire stem of the small blue plastic flag into the ground to mark his burial plot, it entered the earth easily. The cemetery manager explained to me that a family member is asked to mark the grave site to safeguard against anyone being buried in the wrong place. He provided me with a map and a contract showing the site that my parents had bought decades earlier. I knew without the paperwork that this was the spot because of the grave to the left. The marker read, "Glad to be me," in bronze letters beneath my sister's name, Melinda Jean Snow. The phrase had appeared on her personalized license plate. She died at age 31 in a car accident. Daddy died 25 years later of pneumonia on her birthday, January 14th. 365 days in the year, and he died on his daughter's birthday. Quote, "So when your mother goes, she'll be on the right of your father," the manager of the cemetery said, as I put the flag in place. This is a tough time to be thinking about this, but is there any room around here for me? I asked, surveying the hilltop that seemed filled with tombstones and markers. I got divorced a few years ago, so I guess I no longer have a plan for where I'll end up. I doubt it, but let's go back to the office and check, he said. Shockingly, there was one space available next to my sister's and my parents' plot. I planned to be cremated, but he said I could have a marker and my ashes there. I told him I would decide about it after my father's funeral. Like my parents, I am not one to frequent cemeteries. They placed flowers on Melinda's grave on every birthday, but were not regulars. A neighbor down the street, however, drove past our house every afternoon on the way to his wife's grave. "There goes Bob to visit Marion," Daddy would say. "Must be 5 o'clock. We didn't talk much about death, but my father said from time to time he was fond of the phrase the Irish used when proposing marriage. "Will you be buried with my people?" The storied family burial grounds aren't as common now as families disperse thousands of miles away beyond their original village, town, state, or country. As a child, I explored the headstones of members of my father's family in the cemetery at Snow Hill Baptist Church in Dobson, North Carolina. During summer visits, my father took Melinda and me to the graves of his parents and other relatives. He and I took my son Wade on the same sojourn 15 years ago. It was more of a history lesson than a somber memorial. Daddy wanted us to understand how unusual it was that my grandfather, Bird Winfield Snow, was born during the Civil War. My grandmother, Ida Victoria Snow, whose middle name is the same as mine, was born 20 years after my grandfather. Together, they raised 16 children, my father being the youngest. His father was 64 when my father was born. My father was 44 when I was born. So that's how the math works for children born in the 1960s to have a grandfather born in the 1860s. Wade and I looked at photos. Wade and I took photos of the graves belonging to great uncles Frost, Snow, and Ice Snow. I kid you not, I have the photos. Who moved to Surrey County from England in the 1800s. Daddy was very proud of the humor in our family tree. Beyond names on headstones, people's many different preferences for how they will be laid to rest are interesting, and at times even humorous. A friend recounted a story of an eccentric man in the small town who asked to be placed face down in his casket so that when people paid their respects, they can kiss my ass goodbye. My oldest daughter, Olivia, led me to the Westwood Village Memorial Park during a visit to Los Angeles a few years ago. She had researched the celebrities buried there and knew some of the lore. Marilyn Monroe's crypt is usually covered with kisses made by red lipstick from lips of fans paying their respects. Hugh Hefner, founder of Playboy, bought the crypt next to her as soon as she died so that he would eventually be laid to rest beside the famous beauty who appeared on the cover of his first magazine. Talk show host Merv Griffin is also buried at Westwood. His gravestone reads, "I will not be back right after these messages." Roosevelt, one of the oldest of my father's 15 siblings, had his gravestone erected several years before he died. It was one of the biggest markers in the small cemetery next to his church in Dobson. He liked to drive by and admire it. He purposely picked a plot near the edge of the cemetery, so it was visible from the road, and he joked his family members could just drive by and toss flowers over the fence. He and his wife, Eva, were married 73 years. When the two were in their 90s, my father asked his sister-in-law if she ever dated anyone else before she married Roosevelt. "Yes, I did. 2 different young men. And they both proposed. They're both dead now," she said matter-of-factly. "I wish I'd married one of them." Though they bickered, they were devoted to each other. And when Roosevelt died, Eva wanted a living room chair placed by the window facing the cemetery so she could look toward her husband until she was buried beside him. A few weeks after my father died, I went back to the Raleigh cemetery and bought the plot next to my parents and sister. I told the cemetery that I remembered the headline of a column my dad wrote years ago when he and my mom bought their first plots. It read, "It's not like bringing a new baby home." He sure was right about that, I said. "Everybody in this town loved your father," the manager said, "because no matter their politics, their profession, their income, or anything, he said what people were thinking so much of the time." He went on to tell me about how about 15 years earlier, the former cemetery director was so proud of a fancy new sign with a digital screen that flashed the time and temperature nonstop. "Well, your daddy called up here and he said he thought it was in poor taste and that this was a place of peace, not a bank, a sports arena, or a Las Vegas hotel. Nobody wants the time and temperature flashing all night long," the manager said. He was right. A lot of people were telling me that, but nobody else was telling the cemetery director. Finally, our boss came in one day and said, Mr. Snow has worn me down. If he puts this in his column, the whole town's going to be after me. I'm shutting down the clock. The story was a gift as I wrote the check for my cemetery plot. I laughed and felt such a closeness to my father. I don't know the right words to describe the pain my parents felt when they had to purchase a cemetery plot for Melinda long before her time. I will call them brave and strong for going on to live a very good, meaningful life, even when they missed her tremendously. They could be content knowing they raised Melinda and me, glad to be me. I hope I somehow manage the same for my children, or at least come close. I take comfort knowing that no matter where my uncertain life takes me, I will be buried with my people, and no time or temperature will be flashing all night long. Thank you very much. I will explain a little bit about the title of this book, which kind of Stephanie already told you kind of where I am in life. Helen, I think Stephanie said about 17 times, so please turn your phone off.
Alarm set. She always has alarm time to take my vitamins.
Okay. Okay, so the reason it's called Stepping on the Blender, another time life gets messy. Well, I'll back up. So my first book was Rules for the Southern Rule Breaker. So I think all of us have moments when things surprise us or things go wrong or crazy things happen. But maybe I talk about them too much. I don't know. But I would, I had friends from high school and college and in St. Pete that would be like, oh my gosh, Katherine, tell the story about this, tell the story about that. So then my ex-husband was the political editor for the St. Petersburg Times, and we somehow got invited to the White House when Obama was president for a media Christmas party. And a friend of mine, I had got this like organza dress. A friend of mine's like, oh my gosh, you've got to borrow my shoes. And they were gorgeous, velvet with all this organza. And so I wore those to the White House. Before we even got through the metal detector, I could not stand up. It was like I was on stilts. And so I'm leaning on my husband, I'm leaning on the wall. And then finally, so you have a set time when you come in that you go through the receiving line so that you're not waiting for 3 hours. And so we went through the line to actually meet the president and first lady and have our picture taken. And we go up, and this white gloved Marine says, you will call him Mr. President and you will call her Mrs. Obama. And I'm just like leaning against my husband because I can't stand up. And we go through, we get up there, and I said, hello, Mr. President. And then I said, Merry Christmas, Michelle. And I'm just like so flabbergasted that then I was like, I'm so sorry. She's like, it's fine. And they're just like, just keep it moving. So we get in line, and literally right as we got situated, my ankle gave way and I fell against the wall down to the ground. And the next sound I heard was Barack Obama saying, hold on, I got you. And he pulled me up off of the floor. And I said, I'm not drunk. I should not have borrowed these. I borrowed these shoes. They're way too high. I should not have worn them. And he's like, leaned over and said, they're great shoes. I'm glad you wore them. So then we moved on about the way. So the friend in St. Pete who actually loaned me the shoes, who was actually Republican, we have to know all people. We got back to our hotel room and she had texted me, how did it go? I'm like, well, the leader of the free world likes your shoes. And then she's like, Katherine, please write a book. And then she called and she's like, Katherine, this, like, you've got to write a book. And she's just, she's 56 and she's just ran her 50th marathon. Anyway, so she's in Boston. She's done Boston like 5 times. So I get home. She's like, Katherine, you need to write these stories down and blah, 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 blah. And so I thought, I do have these, 10 or so stories in my repertoire. And I'm going to write them down so that my children can have them and some cousins and some friends. And so I took a little memoir writing class at Eckerd College, which is this Presbyterian school in St. Pete out near the beach. And they actually have an amazing writers conference called Writers in Paradise. But anyway, so at the end of that, it was every Thursday night for a semester. So at the end of that class, the teacher's like, Katherine, you might be able to get some of these published. And I said, but I'm not famous. I haven't hiked the Appalachian Trail with cancer. I'm not Janine Wallace. Well, Glass Castle. I haven't had some unusual upbringing. Why would anybody care about my stories? I was just going to take them to Kinko's and staple them together. And she's like, because you aren't famous. You haven't done anything extraordinary. You write about things that we all deal with. Not everybody's fallen on the president, but everybody's had embarrassing moments. Everybody's, lost someone they loved. Everybody's had kids that talked back to them and drove them crazy. Anyway, so I put them together, and then I was still going to take it to Kinko's. And I said, I'll try to send it to like 5 publishers. And then a friend of mine, a friend of a friend, is friends with Lee Smith, a great author from Virginia, actually, but now lives in Hillsborough, North Carolina. She gave it a great little review, and then I managed to get a very small publisher. So that's how those got printed. So that book was, obviously, Rules for the Southern Rule Breaker. So then I just went back to North Carolina. Thank you so much for being here, Elizabeth. I knew you had a curfew. No. Okay, thank you so much. So then I was like, well, check. I wrote the book, and it did fine. And I was very happy. And then, as Stephanie said in my bio, for my last child went off to college. I went back to Chapel Hill. Well, I was going to go back to Raleigh to be close to my parents, but I found an Airbnb in Chapel Hill that I liked more than anything in Raleigh. And it was just the juxtaposition from being there 86 through 90 with my whole life ahead of me to coming back in 2021 was kind of glaring. And then you walk around campus and, it's just like all the little, dive bars and pizza places that we went to are now CBD stores. And, thank God we were there during the duck shorts and like the big t-shirt phase, and everybody's like in leggings and their bra. And so it was just like, oh my, anyway. And then I was also going back divorced, and most of my friends are still married, blah, blah, blah. So it was just like, this is really different moving back at this time. And who did I think of? Asheville native Thomas Wolfe. You can't go home again. So I started just kind of journaling and writing about, I love Raleigh. I love North Carolina. I have like so many people, Nancy and Ronald Reagan's daughter, Patty Smith, has it like her 5th book out to try to understand her relationship with her parents and her past. I adored my parents. I had a really good upbringing, but it was really weird to be back in North Carolina all these years later, just as a different person than when I left. And it's partly maybe North Carolina, it's partly me, it's partly me being self-conscious. But anyway, so I started journaling, and then I'm like, maybe there's some humor and some essays in this. So I started thinking, okay, I'll throw together some more chapters. And that it's not all about going back, because there's flashbacks to parenting, and there are even flashbacks to high school. There's a chapter about being at the Tilson's house, which is the next chapter I'll read. But anyway, so in my mind, I was like, oh, I'll call it, I sprained my ankle putting on Spanx, which I have done. And then I remembered, so then I applied to graduate school. And when I applied to graduate school, this was like a year and a half ago, I found the review that the Southern Literary Review gave my book, the first book. And the reviewer said, when this book came across my desk, Rules for the Southern Rule Breaker. I thought it was going to be some fun chick lit, and I wasn't sure I'd even open it. And I'm just like, chick lit? I'm fine with chick lit. But she's like, I read it and it was, more substantial and funny and interesting than that. So I thought if I do another, I sprain my ankle putting on Spanx, is it going to seem like there's less substance there? So I tried to think of like, okay, what's something a little more serious? So then I thought of the time I stepped on the blender. So 2 Augusts ago, I was going up to North Carolina to teach as an adjunct, and I'd never taught in my life. And so I saw my little bungalow in St. Petersburg that I rent out while I'm away, closer to my parents or my mom. And then that money pays for the Airbnb in Chapel Hill. So I'd had it, everything was great. I had the house cleaned. I was literally leaving the house to drive up to North Carolina. And there are these like great old, y'all might have a set, these like 1957 glasses that somebody gave my parents as a wedding present. And they're really tall and thin, and they're frosted, and they have merry-go-round horses on them, or animals. And I thought, I don't want the renters, I keep them on the shelf. And I thought, I don't want the renters to use those and break them. So I'm going to put them over the refrigerator. So I pulled my chair from the kitchen table over to the refrigerator and put them up one by one. And then in doing so, somehow knocked the blender on the floor. It didn't break. I'm like, okay, great. I don't have to sweep up a blender. Put the last glass up, stepped down, and then stepped on the ninja blade of the blender. And it went up into my heel. Anyway, so I just lay back on the tile floor, and I was just like, I give up. Like I'm yet again, I'm trying to do something, and this happens. And anyway, had to crawl across the house. Ultimately, called a couple friends. They came over. One is a nurse. They're like, one was like, we got to go to the emergency room. And I was teaching 2 days later, like class was starting. And I was like, I can't, like, I have to be in North Carolina. And then furthermore, I already split my trip up at this cute little town right on the Florida-Georgia line called St. Mary's, Georgia. And I was doing a book reading for the first book that night at their bookstore, because the first book came out in COVID, so I didn't do any book readings till like 2 years later. So I was like, I have to be in St. Mary's by 6, and then I got to be in Chapel Hill the next day, and then I have to teach. So finally, my friend who's the nurse said, well, Katherine, if you can, it's your left foot, if you can prop it up on the dashboard, you can go, and we won't make you go to the emergency room. So I literally drove up to North Carolina with my left foot on the dashboard, pulled into St. Mary's, Georgia, got some liquid stitches, walked in. And then it was, a fun crowd of women, and we talked, and I read the essay in the first book about falling at the White House. And I'm clearly limping. And so then the woman goes, somebody asked a question. She goes, are you still limping from when you fell on the president? I'm like, oh no, this is from stepping on the blender this morning. And then it was so then, whatever. I got in my car the next day, and like, I'm not I Love Lucy. Why? Like, I am a well-educated, hardworking mother of 3, why do these things keep happening? And then I'm like, I do try to squeeze too many things in a day, but I think they happen to all of us. And I think we all have those moments where it's like either a small thing, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I left my wallet at home and I have to go to the bank. Or it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe, I've got this terrible illness. Or, oh my gosh, I can't believe my child is suddenly dropped out of school. We all have those moments of stepping on the blender. So that's how I came up with the title. Good. Okay, so what is our time?
It's 6:45, so we're good. Yeah, we still have time to start taking questions.
Okay.
Do another reading, or you can start taking questions now.
No, so I even have more material. I can talk more, or I can do another reading. What do I do? You wanted to start questions at 6:45?
Yeah, usually 6:45 is when we start questions. So if you want to do another reading, that should, and then we can.
Okay, I think I'll do one more
Yeah,
reading.
do it. Great.
Bob's like, read the whole book.
Well, you want to leave people wanting more so they get it.
Exactly. But this gives you, so I kind of did the funny heavy, and this is more just funny. But so back to things we can all relate to. This is about a kind of a fun, quirky family in that I grew up with. And as I've talked to people, some are like, oh my God, I know that family. Like that, I remember that family. You know, everybody had this like unconventional family. And then some people are like, wait a minute, I think I was that family. I have this wonderful illustrator who did both books. And this is called If We Have Wine and Toilet Paper. And this is a little long if I read the whole thing. So my first book came out, like I said, during COVID. I'll read this and then I remember the part I skipped. Okay. This has a shout out to Tom below. My first book, Rules for the Southern Rule Breaker, Mistakes and Lessons Learned, came out in the summer of 2020. I'm sure this book by a no-name author would have been a New York Times bestseller if only the pandemic had not hit. I somehow managed to lure more than 100 people to a launch party on Zoom hosted by Tom Below Books in St. Petersburg, and another 125 to a Zoom talk at Quail Ridge Books in Raleigh. But I don't take this as a big compliment. By July 2020, people would tune into Zoom to watch paint dry for an excuse to drink with others. Laura, one of my photographer friends for the Tampa Bay Times, assembled a montage photo of 12 colleagues looking like the Hollywood squares, each with glasses of wine at their lips during the Zoom talk. Close to 20 dear, brave, and foolish souls hosted various outdoor book signings for me on their back patios, driveways, or standing 6 feet apart inside large living rooms. My friend and neighbor Deanne went through the motions with the city of St. Petersburg to get our brick paved streets closed to traffic so she could serve champagne and cake to 25 neighbors sitting in soccer chairs 6 feet apart. That was the plan, at least. In this case, neither alcohol nor I were the main draw. It was Deanne's cake. Her reputation for baking far exceeded mine for writing. Any mortal baker would have made a sheet cake with the top decorated to look like my violet and pink book jacket. Deanne, however, is not mortal. She made a 5-layer cake with each layer a separate book stacked on the other. The edges were decorated to look like pages, and the spine was decorated to look like my book. In 2020, however, creating this masterpiece that makes the Cake Boss's concoctions look like they were made in an easy bake oven was the least complicated part of the party. An hour before the guests were to assemble on the street, the bottom dropped out of the sky and the rain poured. I'd be totally happy to move it into my house in normal times, but we can't get 20 people all in my house together. I agree. I said, we have to cancel it. At least now I can have the cake to myself. And then I got an awful idea, a wonderful, awful idea. Not as devious as the Grinch's, but pretty bold. I just read a story for the paper on how so many people are selling their signed baseballs and other collectibles to get extra money during the pandemic because they can't work. I interviewed these 2 guys who own an auction house. Their warehouse is huge and is set up with rows of chairs from when people used to go to auctions in person. They were the Kennedy brothers. I'd heard about the Kennedys when I first moved to St. Petersburg. New friends referred casually to a Kennedy wedding or going out on the Kennedys' boat. How did these people in St. Petersburg, Florida know the Kennedys? I kept wondering. Turns out it was a different Kennedy, but they were totally generous and had less scandal. I called Brett. I totally understand if you say no, but is there any way I could have 25 or so masked women come to your auction warehouse in 45 minutes for a book party? I asked. I was just turning the lights off, but I'm turning them back on. Come on, he said. And then I described that party. Okay. The way we threw everything together with 20 minutes reminded me of good family friends from my high school and middle school days. As long as we have wine and toilet paper, we can have a party, Mrs. Tilson said on numerous occasions in my youth. She loved opening their stone house on Cowper Drive to friends, her kids' friends, and nonprofits ranging from the North Carolina Symphony to Friends of the Library. The Tilsons, Judy, her husband Hugh, and their 4 kids operated differently than other families I knew in Raleigh. While their stately home in Hayes Barton was furnished with the requisite antiques from needle-pointed dining room chairs to the walnut sideboards, their family room featured something akin to wooden crates. The furniture was called This End Up and was made by, which I didn't know till I wrote this essay, students at NC State started This End Up. The Tilsons were early customers and eager to support the venture and have their house furnished with furniture neither their kids nor dogs could get dirty. When we all slept over at the Tilsons' house, we had to be home by midnight. Anne would yell, "We're home," in the direction of her parents' room, and we'd walk right back out the door and rejoin the party we just left. If there was no party, we'd go into the kitchen for a late night snack of asparagus wrapped in prosciutto, mini quiches, or whatever was left over from the most recent fundraiser. Back in 7th grade, Anne wore a t-shirt picturing a cool illustration of hands clapping. Her mom had handed it to her one morning when there was no clean laundry. The Tilson kids did their own laundry starting around 6th grade. So when someone's dresser ran dry, they borrowed from a sibling or relied on the giveaway t-shirts from the nonprofits their parents supported. The caption under the clapping hands on Anne's shirt read, "Zap the clap." Oh my God, she blurted in a hushed tone with teeth clenched as she walked into the 2nd period study hall. Guess what zap the clap means? What? I asked. Stop chlamydia. What's chlamydia? I asked. Some kind of venereal disease people get from sex, she said. A guy in my 1st period just asked me if I had it. My mom must have gotten this from the health department. I am so mad at my mom. She wore the shirt wrong side out the rest of the day and berated her mother at dinner that night. Mrs. Tilson brushed off her daughter's embarrassment as dramatic overreacting. Anne, people have to talk about sex and STDs openly to prevent unwanted pregnancies and venereal diseases. Grow up. My parents talked openly at dinner about everyone's day at work, school, politics, funny moments, and other observations. Chlamydia and sex were not on the snooze menu. I didn't tell them about Anne's shirt or the fact that the Tilsons never locked their door or really knew we were home for the night. I didn't want my more conventional parents to have any reservations about Anne's upbringing. But after our family went to the Tilsons' annual wassail party, my parents were Tilson devotees. Wassail, mulled cider with Applejack brandy, gave the party its name, but it was about so much more. The dining room table sagged with at least 20 cakes made by Mrs. Tilson. Little kids decorated cookies at the kitchen table. Teenagers clandestinely took tastes of wassail, and adults from their 20s to 90s met a new face or old friend at every turn. And the good dog Martha, as all the Tilsons called their Springer Spaniel, unabashedly nibbled at the cakes and cookies with barely a second glance from the host. That Judy Tilson made all those cakes herself, my mother said on the way home. She and Hugh register voters on the weekends, and Judy volunteers at half a dozen other places. They host exchange students from around the world, and she knows more about what was in the paper last week than I do, raved my dad, who was the editor of the paper. Oh yes, the exchange students. They gave Anne and her friends some good clout at Needham Broughton High School. All the cool people wanted to get close to Hans, Peter, and Rolf. One path was through Anne's brother, Max, 2 years our senior. The other was through Anne herself. The older girls who wanted to know the exotic boys at Broughton left no path untaken. They offered Ann and me rides home from school, bought us beer, and saved our seats on the front bleachers of soccer games. And then I talk about this little exchange with an exchange student. And then I'm going to jump ahead. I have tried, following Judy Tilson's lead, I have tried to regularly open my house to family members of all ages, from sleepovers for 25th graders to going away parties for longtime colleagues who have been steadily leaving the Tampa Bay Times as newspapers' financial struggles prompted sad departures. After I got divorced, I moved to a 1960s ranch house on open water of Tampa Bay. The only way I could afford it was because it had 3 window units and no central air. I hosted many parties there as people left the paper. Once I was not even in town. I received several emails saying, "That was such a great party. I can't believe I never saw you." Though it was very steamy in May of 2018, I decided to host a watch party for when Meghan married Harry. 25 women assembled to watch the famous nuptials. Many guests, sipping champagne and nibbling scones with clotted cream, sat on the speckled terrazzo floor since there weren't enough seats. It was also 20 degrees cooler than sitting on the furniture. Our oversized mutt, Charlie, thought any woman sitting crisscross applesauce on the floor wanted him to settle into their lap. He moved through more laps that day than any good dancer at the Mons Venus, which is kind of a famous strip bar in Florida. By the time the I-dos were done, my guests were fanning themselves with magazines and patting their foreheads wet with cocktail napkins. We are officially closed for the season, just like the Vinoy and the Don Cesar used to do before they had air conditioning, I announced as Meghan and Harry walked out of St. George's Chapel. "You never close for the season," my friend Tiffany said. "I remember when you ran out of dessert at your 40th birthday party, you brought out raw cookie dough and we stayed another hour." So at my house, if we have wine, toilet paper, and cookie dough, we can have a party. And good friends are always a must on the list. Okay, I feel like I've just talked about myself nonstop. Are there any questions?
For audience, just raise your hand.
Is it the same publisher that published your second book?
That's a good, no, it's not. So the first publisher was a company out of California called She Writes, and they publish about 20 books a year by female authors. And even though it was during COVID and everything was remote anyway, it went well, but it was not great. And so when I did the other one, they'd asked me to do it, said, let us know if you want to do a second book. But I was living in Chapel Hill at the time, and there were other very regional local books. And so I found Listra Books, which is about a 4-person shop right in Chapel Hill. And, everybody can debate in person or remote, but I liked the people, and I got along better and were more on the same page. And it was just great to be in person. Helen,
Have your kids read your books? I don't know that.
that's a good question.
Can you repeat the question just to use a little further?
Have my kids read the books? So I don't think Charlotte, my middle, she's read both. She's the pleaser, the most damaged, I guess. Anyway, so when the first book came out, there's an essay about parenting, and I'll throw a line in from my dad. So I have 2 daughters and a son, and the son came quite a bit later. And by the time he was born, I'm just like, oh my God, I never do anything for him. I just throw him in the car, throw him in front of the TV. And my sweet father was like, good Lord, Catherine, nobody ever read a book to me in my life. And I was Phi Beta Kappa at UNC. So it kind of put things in perspective. So I had an essay about how I felt like he was the ignored child. And then at the end of the essay, I'm like scratching his back. So he was 17 when this one came out. He's like, oh my God, you told people you were scratching my back? That's like creepy. Anyway, so that was Wade's reaction. And then this one, they are, and every essay that I wrote, anybody that was in it, I let them read the essay or kind of told or texted them or emailed them the section. So my kids were in 2 or 3 of these essays, and I let them all read them, and they were fine with it. And then Wade, again, the youngest, is like, you never sent that to me. I'm like, yep, I sent it to your email. But boys in their 20s don't check email. But they seem kind of okay. Nancy.
Did your mom?
Yes. So the first book, I was like, my parents, some of this stuff, I mean, they're very open-minded, very progressive, but they also are very kind of older and conventional. And I'm like, I'll do this. And I'm like, I don't think I'm going to outlive my parents. Like, my sweet father lived to be 97. So finally, I wrote the first one, and I sent them the like reader's copies. So they read the first one, both my mom and my dad. And then the second one, I let my mom read. And there's actually, you know, she would hate to see that I said hell or damn. And there are a couple chapters about dating and online dating. She hates that I'm not like still married to the man I married, you know, in 1993. Not hates, but regrets. She doesn't like change. So it has, I think it's been hard for her. But so now that I'm going back to get, my mom taught at NC State for 40 years. So the final chapter, so much of my life has been following my dad's path as a writer. But the final chapter is about kind of finally seeing like all the work. And my mom went back and got her PhD at UNC when I was an undergrad there. And I'm just like, what is my mom doing on campus? Like, I had no idea what a like strong and brave thing that was. So the last chapter is kind of a dedication to her. So I think I made up for the cuss words with the last chapter. Yes.
So we have a question from Ashley at home. And what advice do you have for someone that would like to write their book?
Nobody wants to hear your stories, Ashley. No. And I was actually, Elizabeth who left earlier. I mean, it's like, write them. And I mean, I'm very lucky that these managed to get published, but the main people you want to hear your story, like you're not making money off of a book. So the main people you want to hear your stories are the people that you care about. So just write them, and seriously, write your 5 chapters or your 10 chapters and print them out and bind them and let them be a legacy to your friends or your coworkers or your children. So yes, write them and don't care. I mean, we talk about this a lot in graduate school. Yeah, just get it on the page. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be the right language. Tell the story. And then you can go back and edit it and fix it later. But yes, go ahead and start and set a time once a week where you write for an hour, and you can do that.
Any more questions from the folks? So we just have a few minutes till the top of the hour. Can you tell us what you're working on now, or is it just grad school?
Well, actually, I have 2 different, grad school. So I have a thesis. So my thesis, which is, I'm not the first person to come up with this, but it's like on improving access to menstrual products on campus. And more schools have free products, not necessarily in the dorms. California is the first state to mandate free products in all of its state universities, but more and more schools, including NC State, University of Michigan, University of Michigan and University of Mississippi have campus-wide access to period products. You know, if you're on campus and you get your period and you don't have a product, you have to miss class. Okay, that's like inequitable education. So it's on why does UNC, the flagship of the state university system, not have campus-wide access. So that's my thesis. And then I've got ideas for 2 more books possibly 3. One is, I don't know, Liquid Pleasure is like this great soul band, funk band out of Chapel Hill. They formed in the 1970s, and they've been playing ever since. And they started out playing college parties around the South, and then ultimately have played at every inauguration since George Bush the first, except for Trump. And they now play in every state at least once a year. They play in Europe for weddings, and it's still like largely the 10 Black men who were friends in 7th grade. And they've endured a lot of racism and kind of had to figure out, how to be a Black band in a white person's world. And Kenny Mann, the founder, is hilarious and tells great stories. They played with Aretha Franklin. And then on the other hand, he's like, Laura Ingraham has never stiffed us. Donald Trump never wants to write a check. I mean, so he's got amazing stories. Roy Williams, it's like Roy Williams' favorite band. And the way they played at Obama's inauguration is they had played at Princeton, and Michelle Obama had been a fan. And then when Obama did a fundraiser at the Dean Dome, Michelle Obama is like, there's this really good band out of Chapel Hill. So anyway, he's got 1,000 great stories, and also has endured a lot of racism and still does. So he's like, I can write the story, but I just got to do the proposal. So I might not write about myself, which is a lot harder.
Well, thank you so much, Katherine, and thanks to everybody who's been here this evening. We'll have you sign some books. And thanks again.
Thank you, everybody.